Karen Mitchell had always believed the world owed her something. At 42, she moved through life with an invisible crown on her head, expecting special treatment wherever she went. Her morning routine included checking social media for things to complain about and rehearsing arguments she might need later in the day. She had perfected the art of finding fault in everything around her. From the way her neighbor parked their car to the temperature of her coffee at the local cafe, Karen's life had not turned out the way she had planned. She had dreamed of being successful and important, but instead found herself working a mundane office job that barely paid the bills. Her marriage had ended 3 years ago when her husband finally grew tired of her constant complaints and negative attitude. Her 2 adult children rarely called anymore, having learned that every conversation would inevitably turn into a lecture about how unfair life was treating their mother. On this particular Tuesday morning in London, Karen was already running late for her appointment at the government building. She had been fighting a parking ticket for 3 months, convinced that the rules didn't apply to someone like her. The ticket was only £30, but it had become a matter of principle in her mind. She had written angry letters to the council, made numerous phone calls to complain, now was finally taking her case to the government appeals office. The morning had started badly from the moment her alarm clock failed to go off. Karen had overslept by an hour, which threw her entire carefully planned schedule into chaos. She rushed through her morning routine, spilling coffee on her favorite blouse and discovering that her car had been blocked in by a delivery truck. By the time she finally got on the road, the morning traffic had reached its peak, and every red light seemed to last forever. As Karen sat in traffic, her frustration mounted with each passing minute. She watched the clock on her dashboard tick closer to her appointment time while she remained stuck behind a bus that seemed to stop at every corner. She began honking her horn at other drivers, shouting complaints from inside her car, and making rude gestures at anyone who dared to drive according to the speed limit. When she finally reached the government district, Karen discovered that the parking situation was even worse than the traffic. Every space seemed to be taken, and the parking meters required exact change that she didn't have. She drove around the block 3 times, growing more agitated with each lap. Finally, she found a space that was technically reserved for government employees, but she convinced herself that her important business gave her the right to park there as she approached the imposing government building with its stone columns and heavy security presence. Karen's frustration reached a boiling point. She had spent the entire drive thinking about how unfair the system was and how everyone was against her. The sight of the formal guards in their traditional red uniforms only made her angrier. To Karen, they represented everything she hated about authority and bureaucracy. Karen pulled into the visitor parking area, ignoring the clearly marked signs about proper procedures. She grabbed her oversized purse, which contained everything, from expired coupons to her latest purchase, a small taser she had bought online after watching too many self-defense videos. She had convinced herself it was necessary protection in today's dangerous world, though she had never actually been in a situation where she needed to defend herself. The guard standing at the entrance was Thomas Whitfield, a 28-year-old man who had served his country with honor for 6 years. He stood perfectly still in his ceremonial uniform, his polished boots reflecting the morning sunlight and his brass buttons gleaming against the deep red fabric. His posture was impeccable, shoulders back and chin up, embodying the discipline and respect that came with his position. Thomas had grown up in a working-class family in Manchester, where his parents had taught him the value of hard work and treating everyone with dignity and respect. His father had worked in a factory for 30 years, never missing a day, while his mother had cleaned offices at night to help make ends meet. They had sacrificed much to give Thomas's opportunities they never had, and he honored their memory. Through his dedicated service, Thomas took his role as a royal guard seriously, knowing that he represented something bigger than himself. He wasn't just standing at the entrance of a building. He was upholding centuries of tradition and serving. As a symbol of stability and honor, every morning he put on his uniform with pride, understanding that tourists and visitors from around the world would see him and form impressions about his country based on his behavior and professionalism. Karen stormed toward the entrance, her heels clicking aggressively on the ancient stone steps that had been walked by countless visitors over the decades. She was already planning her complaint about the parking situation and the inefficiency of government buildings. Perspective. Everyone here was just another obstacle preventing her from getting what she deserved. She had worked herself into such a state of righteous indignation that she could barely think straight. Thomas noticed the approaching woman and prepared to assist her with the standard greeting and security procedures that every visitor had to complete. He had dealt with frustrated visitors before and always maintained his professionalism. Knowing that his calm demeanor often helped de-escalate tense situations, his training had taught him to remain respectful and helpful, no matter how challenging the circumstances became. As Karen reached the entrance, she immediately began her tirade about everything that had gone wrong with her morning. Her voice grew louder with each complaint, drawing curious and concerned looks from other visitors and staff members who were going about their business. Thomas listened patiently, waiting for an appropriate moment to help guide her through the proper procedures, so she could reach her destination and hopefully find some resolution to whatever was troubling her. The morning sun cast long shadows across the building's historic courtyard as this fateful encounter began to unfold. Neither Karen nor Thomas could have imagined how dramatically this ordinary Tuesday morning would change both of their lives forever, setting in motion events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about justice, forgiveness, and the power of human compassion. Thomas maintained his respectful posture as Karen continued her increasingly loud complaints. His hands clasped behind his back in the traditional stance he had practiced thousands of times during his military training. His uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, and his bearing spoke of years of discipline and service to something greater than himself. When Karen finally paused for breath, her face red from the exertion of her angry outburst, Thomas spoke in his calm, professional voice that had been trained to diffuse difficult situations. "Good morning, ma'am. I understand your frustration with the parking situation, and I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced today. If you could please present your identification and inform me of the purpose of your visit, I'll be happy to direct you to the appropriate office and ensure you receive the assistance you need," Thomas said with genuine courtesy, his tone warm and respectful despite the verbal assault he had just endured. Karen's face flushed an even deeper shade of red with pure indignation. The calm professionalism in Thomas's voice only served to infuriate her further. How dare this young man speak to her like she was just another ordinary citizen who needed to follow rules and procedures? "I've been dealing with incompetent people all morning. From the traffic warden who had given her the original parking ticket to the council workers who had dismissed her complaints, and this uniformed guard was just another example of the systematic disrespect she faced everywhere." She went. "Don't you dare tell me what to do," Karen shouted, stepping aggressively closer to Thomas until she was within arm's reach. Her voice echoed off the stone walls of the government building, causing several pigeons to flutter away from their perches. "I pay your salary with my taxes. You work for me, not the other way around. I don't need to show you anything or explain myself to some jumped-up security guard who thinks he's important because he's wearing a fancy costume." Several other visitors stopped their conversations and turned to watch the unfolding commotion. An elderly gentleman with his grandson paused on their way up the steps, the young boy looking frightened by Karen's aggressive behavior. A group of tourists who had been taking photographs of the historic building lowered their cameras to stare at the scene. Even other government employees coming and going from the building slowed their pace to observe what was happening at the main entrance. Thomas remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged despite the verbal assault that continued to pour from Karen's mouth. His years of military service had taught him to remain composed under pressure, and he had encountered difficult people before during his time as a soldier deployed overseas. He knew that escalating the situation would only make things worse for everyone involved, and his primary concern was maintaining the safety and security of all the people in the area. "Ma'am, I completely understand that you're having a frustrating day, and I want to help make this process as smooth as possible for you," Thomas replied, his voice remaining steady and respectful, even as Karen's behavior became more erratic. "These security procedures are in place for everyone's safety, including yours, simply following standard protocols that apply to all visitors. Regardless of their background or the nature of their business here, I'm genuinely here to help you. I'd be happy to assist you in any way I can once we complete the necessary security checks. Karen felt her anger surge to dangerous levels that she had never experienced before. The combination of her terrible morning, the traffic delays, the parking problems, and now this guard's insufferably calm demeanor pushed her beyond any semblance of rational thought. In her twisted logic, his politeness was actually a form of sophisticated mockery designed to humiliate her in front of all these watching strangers. She convinced herself that he was deliberately trying to embarrass her, assert his authority over someone he clearly saw as beneath him. The small crowd that had gathered was now openly staring at the confrontation, some people pulling out their phones to record what was happening. Karen noticed the cameras and felt even more humiliated and angry. She imagined her breakdown would end up on social media, shared and mocked by thousands of strangers who would judge her without understanding what she was going through, without thinking clearly. Her rational mind completely overwhelmed by rage and embarrassment. Karen reached into her oversized purse and pulled out the small taser she had purchased online just 2 weeks earlier. The device was black and silver, about the size of a smartphone, with 2 metal prongs at the end that crackled with blue electricity when she accidentally pressed the test button. She had never used it before and had barely read the instructions, but her rage clouded any capacity for rational thinking or consideration of consequences. Maybe this will get your attention and teach you some respect. Karen screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with fury and desperation as she lunged forward with surprising speed and pressed the activated taser directly against Thomas's exposed arm just below his uniform sleeve. The electrical shock hit Thomas instantly with 50,000 volts of electricity. His entire body convulsed violently as the current coursed through his nervous system, causing his muscles to spasm uncontrollably. He collapsed immediately to the cold stone steps in front of the government building entrance, his ceremonial hat rolling away across the ancient stones as his body twitched from the electrical assault. The sound of the taser's electrical discharge and Thomas's sudden fall created immediate chaos among the gathered crowd, with several people screaming in shock and others rushing to help the fallen guard. Karen stood frozen like a statue, the taser still trembling in her hand, as the full weight of what she had just done crashed down upon her consciousness like a devastating avalanche. The blinding rage that had consumed her thoughts and driven her to this moment of violence was instantly replaced by a cold shock and overwhelming confusion that left her feeling dizzy and disoriented. The reality of her actions seemed impossible to process, as if she was watching someone else's terrible mistake unfold in slow motion before her eyes. Other uniformed guards rushed to Thomas's aid with practiced efficiency, their training immediately taking over as they assessed the situation and began providing assistance to their fallen colleague. Someone in the growing crowd called for emergency medical assistance, while others helped clear the area around Thomas to give the responders room to work. Within seconds, additional security personnel surrounded Karen with professional precision, their faces showing the controlled anger and concern that comes with witnessing an unprovoked attack on one of their own. The taser was carefully removed from Karen's shaking hands, and she was placed in restraints with swift efficiency. Her wrists were secured behind her back with plastic zip ties, while she was read her rights in clear, official language that seemed to echo strangely in her shocked mind. The reality of her situation began to sink in as she watched Thomas lying motionless on the cold stone steps, his fellow guards kneeling beside him with worried expressions etched deeply on their faces as they waited for the ambulance to arrive. The ambulance arrived within what felt like minutes, but seemed like hours. To the anxious crowd, its sirens cutting through the morning air and drowning out the concerned murmurs of witnesses. Paramedics quickly assessed Thomas's condition with professional competence, checking his vital signs and neurological responses while Karen sat in the back of a police car, her hands cuffed behind her back, watching through the window as medical professionals worked to ensure Thomas was stable and had not suffered any serious injury from the electrical assault. As the paramedics carefully loaded Thomas onto a stretcher, he regained consciousness with a groan of confusion and discomfort. Despite everything that had just happened to him, despite being the victim of an unprovoked and violent attack, his first coherent words to the paramedics were asking if the woman who had attacked him was safe and if anyone else in the area had been hurt or was in danger. This remarkable display of concern for others, even after being assaulted with a dangerous weapon, left the paramedics and nearby witnesses speechless with admiration for his character and selflessness. Karen was transported to the Central Police Station for processing, the ride passing in a blur of shocked silence as she stared out the window at the city streets. She had driven through just hours earlier with such different intentions. The charges she faced were serious and potentially life-changing. Assault with a dangerous weapon, assault on a government official in the performance of his duties, and in possession of a prohibited weapon in a restricted government area. Each charge carried significant penalties that could result in years of imprisonment and a permanent criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. As Karen sat in the holding cell, surrounded by cold concrete walls and the sounds of other people who had made similarly poor decisions, the full reality of her situation began to settle into her consciousness like lead in her stomach. Her momentary loss of control, those few seconds of blind rage and poor judgment, had potentially destroyed everything she had worked to build in her 42 years of life. Her job would certainly be lost when her employer learned of her arrest and conviction. Her reputation in the community would be permanently damaged. Her already strained relationships with her children would likely be destroyed completely. Detective Sarah Collins was assigned to Karen's case, bringing with her 15 years of experience as a law enforcement officer who had seen countless people make terrible decisions in moments of uncontrolled anger and frustration. She was a thoughtful investigator who understood that behind every criminal act was a human story of poor choices and missed opportunities for better outcomes. As she reviewed the crystal-clear security footage from the government building's extensive surveillance system, she shook her head sadly at how quickly the situation had escalated from a simple complaint about parking regulations to a violent assault that would change multiple lives forever. Meanwhile, Thomas was taken to the nearest hospital for a comprehensive medical evaluation to ensure that the electrical shock had not caused any hidden damage to his heart, nervous system, or other vital organs. The taser had caused painful muscle spasms and temporary disorientation. But thankfully, the medical tests revealed no permanent physical damage to his body. However, as he lay in the hospital bed wearing a patient gown instead of his proud uniform, Thomas found himself thinking not about his own recovery or the pain he had endured, but about the woman who had attacked him so violently. Instead of feeling the natural human emotions of anger, resentment, or desire for revenge that most people would experience after such an attack, Thomas found himself genuinely wondering what kind of deep emotional pain or desperate frustration had driven a complete stranger to such extreme and dangerous actions. His compassionate nature, which had been shaped by years of military service helping people in crisis situations around the world, made him curious about her story rather than bitter about her actions. Thomas's family arrived at the hospital within hours of receiving the frightening phone call that their son had been attacked while on duty. His mother, Margaret Whitfield, was a recently retired primary school teacher who had spent 30 years nurturing young minds and had raised Thomas to show compassion and understanding, even to those who had wronged him or treated him poorly. She had always believed that hurt people often hurt other people, that understanding this cycle was the key to breaking it and creating positive change in the world. His father, Robert Whitfield, was a former construction worker who had spent his entire career building homes and public buildings that would serve communities for generations. He had taught Thomas from an early age the fundamental values of hard work, integrity, and treating every person with dignity and respect regardless of their social status, background, or behavior. Robert had grown up in poverty, but never let his circumstances make him bitter or resentful toward others who had more advantages in life. "How are you feeling, son?" Margaret asked softly, her weathered hands gently holding Thomas's as she studied his face for any signs of lingering pain or trauma from the electrical shock he had endured. Her eyes showed the deep concern that only a mother can feel when her child has been hurt, mixed with relief that his injuries were not more serious than they could have been. "I'm fine physically, ma'am. Really. The doctors say there's no permanent damage and I should be able to return to duty in a few days," Thomas replied, then paused thoughtfully before continuing. "But I keep thinking about that woman who attacked me. She seemed so incredibly angry and hurt about something much deeper than parking tickets or government procedures. I can't stop wondering what's really going on in her life that would drive her to such desperate actions. What kind of pain must she be carrying to lash out like that at a complete stranger? His parents exchanged knowing glances, their expressions showing they were not at all surprised by their son's compassionate response to being violently assaulted. They had raised him to look beyond people's immediate actions to try to understand the deeper emotions and circumstances that drove their behavior. Throughout his childhood, they had taught him that everyone has a story, everyone is fighting battles that others cannot see, and that true strength comes from responding to hatred with understanding rather than revenge. Robert placed a strong, calloused hand on Thomas's shoulder and smiled with obvious pride at the young man they had raised to embody their values even in the most challenging circumstances. That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes us proud to call you our son, Thomas. Most people in your situation would be focused on their own pain and anger, but you're concerned about helping someone who hurt you. That takes real character and wisdom. Back at the police station, Karen was finally granted her one permitted phone call after hours of sitting alone in the stark holding cell, listening to the sounds of other arrested individuals and contemplating the ruins of her life. She called her sister Linda, the only person in her increasingly small circle who might still care enough about her to provide help during this crisis. Linda had watched Karen's behavior become progressively more difficult and self-destructive over the past several years, and had made numerous attempts to help her sister recognize how her constantly negative attitude and entitled behavior were systematically destroying her relationships and sabotaging her chances for happiness. "Karen, what on earth have you done this time?" Linda asked after the desk sergeant explained the serious charges her sister was facing. Her voice carried a mixture of disbelief, disappointment, and weary resignation that came from years of watching Karen make increasingly poor decisions while refusing to accept responsibility for the consequences of her actions. "It wasn't really my fault, Linda. That guard was being completely disrespectful to me, treating me like some kind of common criminal when I was just trying to handle my business there. He pushed me too far with his attitude, and I just snapped under all the pressure I've been dealing with lately. You know how all these government people are. They think they're better than ordinary citizens like us," Karen replied, her voice still carrying traces of the defiant anger that had gotten her into this situation. Even as she tried to minimize her role in the violent assault, Linda sighed deeply, a sound that carried the weight of decades of sisterly love mixed with profound frustration and disappointment. She genuinely loved Karen and wanted to help her, but she also knew that Karen's persistent inability to take responsibility for her own actions and choices had finally led to this inevitable moment of serious legal consequences. "Karen, listen to yourself. You attacked an innocent man who was simply doing his job, trying to help you follow standard security procedures. This isn't about anyone else's attitude or behavior. This is entirely about the choices you made in that moment. You used a weapon against someone who never threatened you or treated you with anything but professional courtesy." Karen sat in stunned silence for several long moments, Linda's words penetrating through her defensive walls for perhaps the first time in years. The cold reality of her situation, combined with the uncomfortable truth in her sister's voice, began to create tiny cracks in the armor of denial and blame-shifting that had protected her from facing her own problems for so long. Meanwhile, Detective Collins was reviewing witness statements from the dozens of people who had observed the incident outside the government building. Tourist videos captured from multiple angles showed clearly that Thomas had been nothing but professional and courteous throughout his interaction with Karen. Even as her behavior became increasingly aggressive and threatening, the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. This was an unprovoked assault by an angry citizen against a government employee who had done nothing wrong. As evening approached, Thomas was released from the hospital with instructions to rest for a few days and return if he experienced any unusual symptoms. As he walked slowly toward his parents' car, still wearing his civilian clothes because his uniform had been kept as evidence, he made an unexpected announcement that would surprise everyone who knew him. "Dad, I want to do something that might seem strange," Thomas said as they drove home through the darkening London streets. "I want to visit the woman who attacked me. Not to confront her or make her feel worse, but to try to understand what drove her to that moment. I have a feeling there's more to her story than just anger about a parking ticket. Maybe if someone showed her some genuine kindness and understanding, it might help her find a different path forward. Margaret and Robert Whitfield sat in stunned silence for several moments after their son made his extraordinary announcement about wanting to visit the woman who had violently attacked him. The request was so unexpected and demonstrated such remarkable compassion that even parents who had raised him to be understanding and forgiving needed time to process what he was suggesting. They had always been proud of Thomas's character, but this level of grace towards someone who had hurt him went beyond anything they had imagined. After lengthy discussions with her supervisor and the prosecutor's office, Detective Collins agreed to arrange a supervised meeting between Thomas and Karen at the police station, with specific conditions designed to protect both parties and maintain the integrity of the ongoing legal case. The meeting would take place in a secure conference room with officers present, and both participants would need to sign waivers acknowledging that anything discussed could potentially be used in the criminal proceedings. The unusual nature of the request required approval from multiple levels of the police hierarchy. As victim-offender meetings were typically handled through formal restorative justice programs with trained mediators present, Karen had spent 3 sleepless nights in custody, her mind cycling endlessly between self-pity, genuine remorse, and growing awareness of how completely she had destroyed her life with one moment of uncontrolled rage. The holding cell was cramped and uncomfortable, with a thin mattress on, metal bench and fluorescent lights that never turned off completely. The other women in the holding area had shared their own stories of poor decisions and legal consequences, giving Karen her first real glimpse into how her privileged complaints about parking tickets and government inefficiency sounded to people facing genuinely serious problems like homelessness, addiction, domestic violence, systemic poverty. One woman named Maria had been arrested for stealing food to feed her 3 young children after losing her job and being evicted from her apartment. Another woman, Sarah, was facing drug charges. After being caught self-medicating for chronic pain she couldn't afford to treat legally. Listening to their stories forced Karen to confront the reality that her problems, while real to her, were relatively minor compared to the genuine hardships that many people endured without resorting to violence or blaming others for their circumstances. When Detective Collins informed Karen that the guard she had attacked wanted to visit her, Karen's initial reaction was a combination of terror, confusion, and disbelief that left her feeling physically sick to her stomach. She assumed Thomas was coming to confront her about her actions, to make her feel even worse about what she had done, or perhaps to try to convince her to plead guilty to more serious charges that would result in longer imprisonment. The idea that someone would voluntarily want to visit the person who had hurt them seemed impossible for Karen to understand, given her lifetime of holding grudges and seeking revenge against anyone who had wronged her, even in minor ways. Why would he want to see me? Karen asked Detective Collins, her voice small and uncertain in a way that was completely different from the aggressive, demanding tone she had used during the assault outside the government building. I attacked him with a dangerous weapon. I could have seriously hurt him, given him a heart attack, or even killed him if his body had reacted badly to the electrical shock. If someone did that to me, I would want them to suffer as much as possible for as long as possible. I would never want to see them again, unless it was in court to watch them get punished. Detective Collins studied Karen's face carefully, noting the genuine confusion and fear in her expression as she struggled to understand Thomas's motivations. In her 15 years of police work, she had rarely encountered situations where assault victims requested to meet with their attackers out of compassion rather than anger or desire for confrontation. The detective had initially been skeptical of Thomas's stated motivations, wondering if he might be planning some kind of verbal confrontation or emotional revenge against Karen, but his consistent demonstration of concern for Karen's well-being throughout the investigation had convinced her that his intentions were genuinely peaceful and constructive. He says he wants to understand what happened that morning and see if there's anything he can do to help you move forward from this situation, Detective Collins explained, watching Karen's reaction carefully for any signs of manipulation or deception. I've been a police officer for 15 years. and I've handled hundreds of assault cases involving victims and perpetrators. I've never seen anything quite like this before. Most victims want justice, punishment, financial compensation, or at least complete distance from the people who hurt them. This young man seems genuinely concerned about your personal welfare and future prospects despite the serious crime you committed against him. Karen spent the remaining hours before the scheduled meeting pacing the narrow confines of her small cell and trying to prepare herself mentally for what she expected would be the most difficult and emotionally challenging conversation of her entire 42 years of life. She had never been forced to face someone she had wronged so directly and personally without the ability to walk away when things became uncomfortable. Throughout her life, when relationships ended badly or conflicts arose with friends, family, members, or colleagues, she had always been able to simply leave the situation, change jobs, move to a different neighborhood, or avoid the people involved until the problems faded from her. Immediate memory. The meeting room at the police station was small and sterile, with institutional beige walls, fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows on the basic furniture, and a security camera in the corner that would record everything said and done during their conversation. When Thomas entered the room wearing casual civilian clothes, a simple blue sweater and dark jeans, instead of his impressive ceremonial uniform, Karen was struck by how surprisingly young and ordinary he looked without the formal trappings of his official government position. She realized with a shock of recognition that she had attacked not just an abstract symbol of authority that she resented and blamed for her problems, an actual human being with his own personal life, loving family, individual dreams and aspirations, and complex feelings about the world around him. This revelation hit her harder than she had expected, adding another layer of guilt and shame to the emotional burden she was already carrying. Thomas sat down across from Karen at the metal table, his movements careful and deliberate as he settled into the uncomfortable plastic chair that had probably been used for thousands of similar difficult conversations over the years. Despite the formal police station setting and the obvious presence of uniformed officers nearby who were monitoring their interaction for safety purposes, Thomas managed to project an atmosphere of calm, safety, and non-threatening openness that began to ease some of Karen's defensive tension and fear about what he might say to her son. "Are you absolutely certain this is what you want to do?" Robert asked carefully, his voice carrying both admiration for Thomas's compassionate heart and concern for his emotional well-being. "This woman used a dangerous weapon against you without any provocation. She could have caused you serious permanent injury or even killed you. Most people would want nothing more to do with someone who had attacked them so viciously, and no one would blame you for feeling that way." Thomas looked out the car window at the familiar London streets passing by, his mind replaying the events of the morning and trying to understand the pain he had seen in Karen's eyes just before she had lashed out with the taser. Despite everything that had happened, despite the physical pain and the shock of being attacked, he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman who had hurt him was herself deeply wounded and desperately in need of someone to show her a different way of dealing with her problems. "I've been thinking about it all afternoon while I was lying in that hospital bed," Thomas explained thoughtfully. "Yes, she hurt me, and yes, what she did was completely wrong and inexcusable. But I keep remembering the look in her eyes right before she snapped. It wasn't just anger, Dad. It was desperation, fear, and a kind of deep sadness that I've seen before in people who have lost hope. During my military service, I learned that hurt people often hurt other people, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is respond to hatred with unexpected kindness." Margaret reached over from the front seat to squeeze her son's hand, her eyes filling with tears of pride at the young man they had raised. She had spent decades as a teacher dealing with difficult children who acted out because of problems at home or emotional pain they couldn't express properly, and she recognized the wisdom in Thomas's approach even though the situation was far more serious than anything she had encountered in her classroom. Detective Collins spent the rest of that day building her case against Karen, interviewing witnesses and reviewing the extensive video evidence that made the assault charge completely straightforward. However, when Thomas contacted her that evening to request permission to visit the defendant, she was initially hesitant to approve such an unusual meeting. Victim-offender contact was typically handled through formal mediation programs with trained counselors present, not informal visits. That could potentially compromise the legal proceedings. Mr. Whitfield, I understand your compassionate intentions, but I have to consider your safety and the integrity of the case, Detective Collins explained during their phone conversation. This woman demonstrated that she's capable of sudden violence against someone who is simply trying to help her. Meeting with her could be dangerous for you personally. Her defense attorney might try to use any contact between you to claim some kind of coercion or interference with their client's rights. Thomas listened respectfully to the detectives' concerns but remained firm in his conviction that visiting Karen was the right thing to do. He had thought carefully about the potential risks and complications, but felt strongly that his military training and natural ability to remain calm under pressure would help him handle any difficult moments that might arise during their conversation. More importantly, he believed that sometimes taking a calculated risk to help another human being was worth more than protecting oneself from potential problems. "Hello, Karen," Thomas said quietly, using her first name in a way that immediately humanized their interaction and moved it beyond the formal victim-offender dynamic that had brought them together. His voice was gentle but not condescending, carrying genuine warmth that Karen had not heard directed toward her in longer than she could remember. "I wanted to thank you for agreeing to meet with me today. I know this must be incredibly difficult and uncomfortable for you, and I appreciate your willingness to have this conversation." Karen stared at Thomas in complete bewilderment, her prepared defenses crumbling before she could even deploy them. She had expected anger, accusations, demands for apology, or attempts to make her feel guilty about her actions. Instead, she was facing kindness and gratitude from someone she had violently attacked just days earlier. The cognitive dissonance was so overwhelming that she couldn't immediately process what was happening or formulate any kind of response. "I don't understand," Karen finally managed to whisper, her voice barely audible in the small conference room. "Why are you here? Why are you being nice to me? I hurt you. I attacked you with a weapon when you were just trying to do your job. I could have caused you serious permanent damage or even killed you. You should hate me. You should want me to be punished as severely as possible for what I did to you." Thomas leaned forward slightly, his expression showing patience and genuine interest in understanding Karen's perspective rather than judgment or condemnation. His military training had taught him that most conflicts arose from misunderstanding and fear rather than true malice. And his intuition told him that Karen's violent outburst was the symptom of much deeper problems that had been building in her life for years. "I've been thinking about our encounter constantly since it happened," Thomas explained thoughtfully. "What struck me most wasn't the physical pain from the taser, though that was certainly unpleasant. What I can't stop thinking about is the expression on your face in the moments before you snapped. I've seen that look before during my military service when I was deployed overseas, helping people in crisis situations. It's the look of someone who feels completely overwhelmed, powerless, and desperate. I recognize it because I've been trained to help people who are struggling with those kinds of feelings." Karen felt tears beginning to form in her eyes for the first time since her arrest, though she fought hard to maintain control of her emotions. Thomas's perceptive observation had cut straight through all her defensive barriers and touched something deep inside her that she had been trying to ignore for months or even years. The kindness in his voice was breaking down walls she had built to protect herself from feeling vulnerable or exposed. "I want you to know that I don't harbor any anger or resentment toward you," Thomas continued, his words carefully chosen to convey sincerity without sounding rehearsed or artificial. "I believe that people are generally good, and that when someone acts out violently like you did, it's usually because they're experiencing pain or frustration that feels unbearable. I'm not excusing what you did. It was wrong, and there have to be consequences, but I am interested in understanding what brought you to that breaking point." Over the next hour, something remarkable happened in that sterile police station conference room. For the first time in years, Karen began to talk honestly about her life without trying to blame others or make excuses for her behavior. She told Thomas about her divorce, her strained relationships with her children, her financial struggles, and her growing sense that life had somehow passed her by while she wasn't paying attention. She described feeling invisible and unimportant in a world that seemed to value youth and success above everything else. Thomas listened without interrupting, offering occasional nods of understanding that encouraged Karen to continue sharing her story. His genuine attention and non-judgmental responses created a safe space for her to examine her own behavior honestly for perhaps the first time in her adult life. As she spoke, Karen began to realize that her pattern of lashing out at others was really a way of avoiding the painful work of looking at her own contributions to her problems. When their time was nearly up, Thomas made an offer that would change both of their lives forever. Karen, I know you're facing serious legal consequences for what happened, and I can't change that. But I want you to know that I've spoken with the prosecutor about requesting a restorative justice program instead of traditional sentencing. If you're willing to do the work, real work on understanding and changing the patterns that led to this moment, I'd like to help support your journey toward becoming the person I believe you're capable of being. Karen stared at Thomas through her tears, unable to comprehend the level of grace and forgiveness he was offering to someone who had wronged him so completely. For the first time in years, she felt a tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, her story didn't have to end with this terrible mistake. Maybe there was still time to become someone better, someone worthy of the unexpected gift of compassion she was receiving from the person she had hurt most.